Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hi there, how are you all? You're all having a great week. I enjoyed my ATM week. Has this been a useful set of shows? It'd be great to hear from you if it is. I'm still here in Vietnam, but I'm holed up in my hotel room. I've busted my back. I can barely walk, which isn't fun. So, it leaves me here to be able to record these intros and get this latest show out for you. I'm just about to leave Hoi An. I've had an amazing time here. What a place. If you ever want to come out to Vietnam, you've got to visit Hoi An. It's probably the best place I've visited in Vietnam and one of the best places I've visited in the world. Anyway, welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, which is brought to you by Kraken, and continuing the theme of ATMs this week. I have an interview with Bill Repasky from Frost Brown Todd, a legal firm based across the States. And I organised this interview as part of ATM Week because I wanted to cover more about the regulations regarding the operation of Bitcoin ATMs. But before we get into that, I do have a message from my show sponsors. So firstly, today's show is brought to you by Coin ATM Radar. Buying from a machine is much more reliable and safer from meeting some random person in a random location. With Coin ATM Radar, you can find Bitcoin ATMs and other services where you can buy or sell crypto for cash. On their website, you can search by coin, address, and you can also search by geo area, so country, state, and city. You can also filter results. A lot of people complain about the fees for Bitcoin ATMs, where you can even filter by lowest fee. They also have a mobile app which is available on the Apple and Google App Stores, and they also fully support operators. So if you operate one or even several machines, it definitely makes sense for you to submit your information about locations to Coin ATM Radar, which is free of charge and will bring additional visibility to your service. If you want to find out more, head over to coinatmradar.com, which is coinatmradar.com. Also, today's show is brought to you by LibertyX. If you want to buy Bitcoin instantly and don't want to wait days for a wire or bank transfer, you definitely need to check out LibertyX. They operate America's largest network of Bitcoin ATMs, cashiers, and kiosks with thousands of locations across 43 states. You can pay however you want, whether it's cash or debit card, and the process is super easy. I know because I tried it out when I was out in the States and I downloaded their app. All you need to do is download the app from the App Store and create a free account. You can search for your nearest purchase location, provide your Bitcoin address, and then you can complete your payment buying anything from $1 up to $3,000 a day. The Bitcoin is delivered for you instantly before you leave the store. To find out more, head over to libertyx.com, which is libertyx.com, or search for LibertyX in the Apple or Google App Stores. Okay, so far this week, we've heard a lot about the experiences of operators and manufacturers in the sector. But one element that is always front of mind with the Bitcoin industry is regulations, and this is absolutely no different for the operation of Bitcoin ATMs. So today, in my fourth episode for ATM Week, I'm joined by Bill Repasky from law firm Frost Brown Todd to explain the potential hurdles for Bitcoin ATM businesses, why it matters, and what it means for the future of the industry. Bill talks about the disparity between the current regulatory system and the new market, the problems that arise between state and federal regulations, and where FinCEN and money transmitter licenses fit into the ATM landscape. So this was a great interview. It really helped me, so I'm really grateful to Bill coming on. If you do have any questions about this, you know you can reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. And yeah, look forward to hearing from you. Hi there, Bill. How are you?
I'm doing well this morning, Peter. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you for coming on the show. We're on vastly different time zones. If I'm doing this, I'm in the center of the world in England, and I'm either speaking to somebody forward or ahead of me, but we're on vastly different times because I'm out here in Vietnam. You're there in Ohio, so different times.
And Peter, I'll correct you. I'm here in Louisville, Kentucky this morning.
Ah, I thought you were Ohio.
We're on the Ohio River in the United States and just downstream from the state of Ohio, but in Louisville, Kentucky, Peter, and it doesn't matter.
All right. Okay. Well, listen, I've been running this week of shows dedicated to understanding more about the Bitcoin ATM industry. I've done 3 shows so far. I've spoke to operators and manufacturers, but often those interviews kind of go into the regulatory area, so it's obviously great to speak to you about this. But firstly, could you just tell me a bit more about yourself, get a bit about your background, tell me a bit about Frost Brown Todd, and why you guys have ended up becoming kind of experts in this area?
Well, Peter, glad to do it. And again, my name is Bill Repasky. I was born in Ohio, Peter, but I went to University of Michigan, which means I was a traitor to the state of Ohio by attending a different university, which has a big rivalry, and then went down to Vanderbilt Law School in Nashville, Tennessee. And
Did you stay a Buckeye?
I still support the Buckeyes and University of Michigan when they play. So I'm impressed that you know about this.
So what do you do? What do you do at Thanksgiving then?
I have a lot of fun because sometimes it doesn't really matter, Peter, who wins in the game. It's just wonderful. Football season in the Midwest is unique, and it's great to be there.
Do you know what it was? I actually used to date a girl from Ohio, so I got indoctrinated into supporting the Buckeyes.
They're wonderful people in Ohio and Michigan.
Yeah.
Actually, Peter, I want to tell you, after I graduated from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, I began a career as a bank lawyer and ultimately moved in-house to one of the largest banks in America. And while there, I did a variety of different types of work, including operational compliance. And when I got started, the federal regulators' interest in anti-money laundering, the Bank Secrecy Act, and just general issues about the movement of money became front and center in the compliance world. So I learned what I think we'll be talking about today from the inside out, meaning working with a financial institution, a traditional financial institution, and then also with a business that did card processing and other related businesses that required it to have a money transmitter license for certain of its operations. So I picked up that knowledge for my 16 plus years inside the industry. Then I moved over to Frost Brown Todd. Frost Brown Todd is one of the Midwest's largest law firms, if not the largest law firm. And about roughly 3 years ago, we recognized the importance of the cryptocurrency blockchain space and decided to collect a group of experts in their various subject areas that we thought would be most useful for, let's say we'll call them cryptocurrency related business or virtual currency related businesses. From people who are experts in corporate formation, organization, those ICOs that everybody talks about, all the way down to people in my subset, which is compliance with federal and state laws that may impact the operations of various blockchain-related businesses.
Wow. Okay. So that was kind of a brave area to go into. Tricky.
Well, it's an unavoidable area to go into, as we've learned, and I think most of us in the crypto space have learned over the last several years. Despite my personal libertarian leanings, we know to interface with American commerce, so to speak, we've got a couple of different masters that we still have to keep an eye on while we are engaging in the virtual currency businesses in the United States. And it might be brave, but it's unavoidable. We have to come up with plans and approaches and develop business plans, honestly, that account for all these factors and help us succeed in what we want to do in our various virtual currency businesses.
Right. And if you have a libertarian leaning, then I guess when you first heard about or discovered Bitcoin, it must have resonated with you a certain amount.
Oh, absolutely. I still think the potential is limitless in this area. I'm very excited to be involved in the industry and to be providing legal counsel where I can.
Let's stick with Bitcoin for now. What do you make of the progress of Bitcoin? How I know regulators are looking at it more closely now, but it hasn't ever been an outright ban, and it doesn't even feel like we are heading to an outright ban. Has that surprised you?
It hasn't surprised me. There's too much, good in the DNA of Bitcoin to consider an outright ban. I do not believe that the regulators' interests lie in that area right now. In the largest possible sense, as a person who spends their time with, let's just call it roughly banking regulations, we're trying to fit a round and a movable shape into what is a true square peg in the regulatory structure. And this was a square peg, so to speak. The regulations were developed before the internet came about, before people began to develop the concept of the possibilities and potentials of blockchain technology. And so what we're trying to do is shoehorn new technology into old regulatory structures.
Right, I see. Do you think it's time for an update on certain regulations then? Are certain areas, do you think, a bit outdated?
Well, I absolutely believe that. Now, there are a number of different points I would want to run off with that great question, Peter. But the first thing I want to say is that when the industry really got up and running and all the fire in the world was under it, we were dealing with regulators who simply didn't understand the concepts or the principles. And it seems like so much of my time was spent explaining what a distributed ledger was and how it is not like the coming of the devil into the world. And I have seen, and well, personally believe, that over the last several years, that the individuals who are responsible for the administration and implementation of the regulations that are causing us so much concern are getting a lot smarter. And I'm going to just give you one example. You probably have heard of the federal entity known as FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. FinCEN is a regulatory body that is primarily over what's called the Bank Secrecy Act. And this is a part of the federal laws of the United States that are causing or that are creating so many issues and uncertainties in the virtual currency space. And we'll dive down into that in a bit. But when we first got involved with businesses in this area, there was a tremendous amount of uncertainty about how FinCEN would look at various different aspects of the blockchain technology when it comes to applying its existing, again, the ones we mentioned, the old school laws. And we saw almost unexplainable and unreconcilable opinions and guidance from these people. However, I will say in their defense that over the last couple of years, they are really beginning to grasp the concepts that we, the businesses, are dealing with. Now, that doesn't mean we always like the results that they're getting. But for instance, the latest FinCEN guidance came out about 2 months ago now, and it is a much better, a holistic approach to looking at the various CVC or convertible virtual currency businesses that are operating and trying to explain how they fit into prior guidance. That document by itself is probably worth a read by any business person who's interested in getting into this space, from the ICO all the way down to the CVC ATM operator. I know we often call it a Bitcoin ATM, and that's a great, term to use at a cocktail, but we all know that it's often more than just Bitcoin. And FinCEN actually calls it a CVC, convertible virtual currency ATM or kiosk. So I think I got also off track with what you were asking. Do I think the regulatory structure is where it needs to be? The answer is clearly no. But it appears that the momentum at those levels of government are to try to take a heavy hammer to the old school regulatory structures and legal structures and try to hammer them into a shape that is more accommodating or more understanding of the virtual currency related businesses.
Yeah, because it feels like kind of draconian. It feels like with KYC, AML, we are potentially losing a lot of the privacy opportunities that Bitcoin presents us for what really feels like a very limited, a very low number of actual criminal uses of Bitcoin.
Well, you're right. As I complimented you on that question quite a while ago, that your question poses so many different rabbit holes we could run down. You're exactly right. Taking a look at this just at the highest level for people that don't have a basic understanding, and tell me if I'm taking in the right direction, and bring me back to where you want me to go at any moment, Peter. But
yeah, sure.
Let's say I get a phone call from an individual who's interested in starting a virtual currency business. And just to keep things simple, let's pick one example. We've got a fella or a person who's interested in starting a Bitcoin ATM operation someplace in the United States, let's say. And for the time being, we'll keep it the United States. There are essentially 3 areas of laws and regulations that I first want to talk to this individual about. And Peter, let's say it's you that's come to me.
Uh-huh.
The first thing that I honestly like to begin the discussion with is think about the old school aspects of running a business. No disrespect to anybody, but we have brilliant people that I speak to who are interested in that Bitcoin operating. Peter, you would fall in that group, right? But I sometimes think we have to start by actually getting the P's and Q's in place with basic, boring business fundamentals, such as, how are you going to organize yourself as a business? For instance, are you going to form as a corporation or a limited liability company? What are you going to do? How are we going to do basic things for the operation of the Bitcoin ATM, such as where are you going to site it? And when you find a location, and it's sort of funny, but our experience or my experience in dealing with clients who have been citing ATMs is that it is location. The same machine placed just a few blocks away can turn overnight into a dog or a very profitable site. But we have to have leases. I also once took a call from a client who said, my wife is going to shoot me if the criminals do not shoot me first. And what he was explaining to me is that in his operations of his Bitcoin ATM, the act of moving money into fiat currency, US dollars in this case, into and out of a kiosk location made him a very vulnerable target in a particular city, which is not known to be one of the safer places in America. And we had to work with that old school business problem of figuring a way to allow him to load and unload the kiosk with US currency. So there are some basic things, plus such, do you need to have a license to operate in the city of Chicago? Do you need to have, some type of business license in the state of Iowa or wherever you may be? Some basic old school regulatory issues and legal issues to consider at the front end. Then you can move into the issues that I think we should spend a little more time talking about, which are the regulatory issues that we often discuss about Bitcoin operations. Again, we're going to stay with just the Bitcoin ATM example for this discussion. The first one is federal. Those are promulgated by the United States government. And do we have obligations there? And then later we can talk about, are there unique state obligations that a Bitcoin operator may have to comply with? But let's stay with the federal for just a second. At the federal level, at the beginning, much was unknown. And a lot of us were making very hard and difficult educated guesses. But now we have greater certainty in knowing what the federal government will expect of us under the federal laws. And bottom line is, if you are going to run a Bitcoin operation here in the United States, Peter, you are going to have to register with FinCEN. Why FinCEN? Well, the law that is triggered by this Bitcoin operation or a Bitcoin ATM operation is known as the Bank Secrecy Act. And the Bank Secrecy Act says that that law applies to someone who is a financial institution. And that term, financial institution, is almost obscenely broad. I think there are 23 separate definitions of financial institutions, all the way from the traditional common banks down to what is known as a money services business. And that's where a Bitcoin ATM operator is going to fall within that pocket, the money services business, and specifically as a money transmitter within that money services business universe. And so if we are required to comply with the Bank Secrecy Act, what does that mean for you as an operator? The first thing you want to do, and the first thing you have to do, is you have to register with FinCEN. That, I'm probably letting out a trade secret, but you don't need a lawyer to do that. It is an online form. It's a checklist document. Honestly, anybody can complete it within 30 to 60 minutes maximum. You don't need to retain a lawyer to do that. We're happy to do that. It's an online form. If my memory is right, it's Form 107 on the FinCEN's portal, and you simply go through and populate the information about your business in there, and you need to register. You have to register. The downside of not registering is, I believe, there's a maximum federal criminal penalty of up to 5 years imprisonment. Plus, there's atrocious fines. Considering the risk of spending 30 minutes of your time registering versus not registering and operating the business, I think it's a pretty easy decision to make. But when you register, what that means that once you start running your MSB business, your ATM operation, you have to comply with the law. And the main issue there is going to be compliance with the Bank Secrecy Act laws, what a lot of people call the anti-money laundering portion. Now, the Bank Secrecy Act actually got started, I think during the Civil War, but it has evolved over time, Peter, to be the primary tool that the United States has to fight organized crime and the laundering of money generated through criminal enterprise. But the AML, or the anti-money laundering program that a MSB, again, you as a Bitcoin ATM operator have to have in place, is set out. And there are people like myself and others who regularly prepare these programs, but you have to have one. It's got to be on writing. It's got to be printed off on a piece of paper and sitting in a file someplace. If or when somebody comes in and begins inspecting you. The AML program essentially touches on a couple different points. You have to create internal policies for complying with the BSA. You have to designate a compliance officer within your organization. You have to train everybody who's going to be working in this space to know what the Bank Secrecy Act requires and doesn't require. You have to consider testing the program. Well, you have to test the program, whether it's done through an outside testing firm or an inside operation depends upon the facts and circumstances. And then you have to be able to reasonably identify the users or your customers in our case. And then you lastly have to file any reports that the Bank Secrecy Act requires, such as, for example, currency transaction reports or suspicious activity reports, or under the new OFAC guidance, which came out just again a couple weeks ago, any reports regarding transactions which occurred that violate OFAC or were with an individual that is found on one of those OFAC lists.
Well, so I've got an interesting question there then, because I was looking into this and I previously had a lady on my podcast called Caitlin Long. I don't know if you're aware of her. She works out up in Wyoming, pushing, I'm going to say cryptocurrency and blockchain forward, but...
and brilliantly so, too. read her stuff. Wyoming is a very interesting state in our nation.
Yeah. So I'm going to be up there soon for her event. But, one of the things she said to me, and I've just found the stat, is that of the 16 million suspicious activity reports that were received, they only resulted in 296 convictions, which is 0.002%. So
Yes.
It seems very low, and therefore the rules seem very draconian for a very low conviction rate. But then I ask the question, well, is the low conviction rate because maybe there isn't enough information to prosecute on some of these things, or is it that the Bank Secrecy Act and the guidelines act as a deterrent, or is it just the fact that this is draconian? Like, do you have a view yourself on this?
Well, I'm not a criminal lawyer, and so I probably could not opine as to that conviction rate issue. I do want to suggest, though, to people listening to you, that if you have an obligation to file a SAR or suspicious activity report, do it. This is one of the areas where we see financial institutions, including money services businesses, therefore including Bitcoin ATM operators, getting dinged with hefty financial penalties from those regulators where you do not file SARS. The filing of a suspicious activity report puts data into the federal government's computer database where it's used in ways I am not privy to. Maybe it's for tracking, developing trends or analysis. Sometimes it's actually for running after bad guys, if I can use that broadly. But I can't draw the link. It may just be that they don't have the resources. I do know, for instance, this is not necessarily on point, but one of the issues about ATM operators is we obviously have to follow BSA. And not to confuse you or the listeners too much, but while FinCEN, that governmental organization, is the primary regulatory body responsible for overseeing the Bank Secrecy Act, it is the Internal Revenue Service that has been designated as the agency that will conduct audits and exams of money services businesses, including their compliance with the AML program. And it's only in the last couple of months that the IRS, or at least that I've seen the IRS, starting to actually act as an examiner of ATM operators. We are now seeing IRS requests for examination going out. And those are fascinating in terms of what the IRS is asking and looking for during the exam process. This was, in my opinion, essentially unknown. And now we're beginning to actually see real world examples of what is being sought and solicited in the exam process, Peter. And I don't want the IRS to come and audit me, please. But I see that the IRS is sort of where some of the other regulatory authorities were 2 years ago. They haven't a clue. They're asking things that simply are not appropriate or relevant, Peter, to a basic Bitcoin operator. Now they're asking for it, and we're going to have to explain what we have and what we don't have and why we don't have it. Or it could be, in all due defense to those guys, that the examiners are asking for everything because they're really not sure what they want to see yet. And so therefore, that's their job. I'm going to put our ATM operators to a tremendous amount of work and sleepless nights because I'm not sure what I want to see. And until I see it, well, I'll know whether I wanted to see it or not. I don't know if that makes sense, but we are seeing developments in this area. And I think we'll have more information to report, as we watch a couple of these businesses run through the exam cycle.
Next up, I talked to Bill more about Bitcoin ATM regulations, but before that, I have a message from my amazing sponsors. So just a quick shout out, firstly, to Kraken. You know who they are. They're the best exchange in the world. With spot, futures, margin trading, their OTC desk, and indices, they've got all your trading needs covered. With security in their DNA, it is the only place I now buy and sell Bitcoin. If you want to join me in supporting Kraken, head over to kraken.com, which is KRAKEN.com. Also, my other regular main sponsor, BlockFi, the future of Bitcoin and financial services. They offer crypto-backed loans. They've got crypto interest accounts, which I'm using. You can find out more at blockfi.com, which is BLOCKFI.com. Next up, Dropbit, the best mobile wallet for Bitcoin. Text and tweet Bitcoin to your friends. It's just like a Venmo for Bitcoin. You got to check them out. Head over to dropbit.app, which is DROPBIT.app. And last but not leastly, Accounting, the best tax calculator in the market. Also includes an amazing portfolio manager, and it connects to all major wallets and exchanges. If you want to find out more, head over to accounting.com, which is ACCOINTING.com. So, going back to wanting to be a Bitcoin operator, that's the first thing. You have to register with FinCEN.
Correct.
And you have to submit suspicious activity reports if you see them. But there are various other considerations as well, right? And also, aren't they split between federal and state level regulations?
That's exactly right. Let's take us back to the first conversation where you telephoned me about operating a Bitcoin ATM. The first thing we spoke about is, do you have a good old school business plan in place? Have you figured out your budgets and what, et cetera, et cetera. Then we talked about the federal registration and the other federal laws that might apply to the operation. Then the next question I'll probably ask you is, where do you intend to operate? Because depending upon where you will be operating your kiosks, there may be state law and regulations that have to be complied with. And in this area where we will primarily focus, depending upon the state that you choose for your kiosks, whether we have to comply with what's known as a money transmitter licensing situation. And I always like to keep people on track by saying, when we're talking about the federal laws and regulations, we're talking about registration and what's required. If we're talking about the state laws, then we're talking about licensure. Does the state require us to have a money transmitter license depending upon the facts and circumstances of your ATM operation? And as you've already guessed or learned, that the states are all over the board on this. Whether a ATM operator will have to have a money transmitter license and go through all the rigmarole, the time and expense necessary to obtain one.
In every state they operate.
Correct. And, I may know a thing or two about this, but I can guarantee you that if you told me that you wanted to operate in a particular state, I would still go back and immediately look at what has happened in the last day or two, because this is in a state of flux. Many states have passed laws that are becoming effective now, new regulations. I usually and often will end up calling the head of the unit that's in charge of money transmitter licensing and said, okay, I just read all this stuff. I read your regs. I read your guidance, yada, yada. What's your position on all this? Because everything changes. And you can't count on what you knew yesterday still being true today in all cases. For instance, you spoke about Wyoming. Wyoming has made the public policy decision to be one of the most crypto-friendly states in our union. And they've done some wonderful stuff out there to assist in this area. But then you have other states, let's say New York, for example, who you talk to these guys, they tell you we are crypto friendly. But anybody who has tried to go through the Bitcoin licensing process will probably have a different position. as a business person. Now, in fairness to the regulators of New York, they say we want to create a level playing field. We do not want the flim-flam artists or con people playing in our space and doing injury to our citizens. So our regulatory structure actually helps the honest and legitimate business person. But moving through that New York process is been very, very difficult and very expensive to comply. Now, having said this, just in the last week or so, at the New York State Department of Financial Institution, they reorganized themselves to create what's known as a Research and Innovation Division. This is the group that's going to be responsible for virtual currency businesses in the Empire State, the state of New York, including the bit licensing. So it appears that they're collecting the people that know this area, want to be in this area, and perhaps it may get better, or it just may be a bureaucratic shuffling in state government and, nothing will change. But, that's a new twist in the New York bit licensing. And I don't want to just pick on New York because, as I mentioned earlier, New York believes that it is motivated by the best and highest purposes. It just can be particularly burdensome to comply with the requirements necessary for a bit license. But New York's not particularly alone. Depending upon the state, we've got to actually open up the laws and the regulations on a state matter to see whether we have to obtain a MTL, money transmitter license. For instance, and I'll give you one example, facts and circumstances can make a difference. Let's say you wanted to operate in the state of Texas. You may not have to have a money transmitter license if you do wallet-to-wallet exchange, meaning that you're essentially just loading cash into the kiosk and loading your own coin for sale to your customers. But if your kiosk hooked up to an exchange, or if your kiosk allowed for the conversion of one virtual currency for another, then it is likely under those facts and circumstances that you are going to need to have an MTL in the state of Texas. We just need to know what you're going to do, and we need to talk to the regulators. And if you do happen to have a money transmitter license, this can be honestly a significant deterrent to operating in that state, and it needs to be part of your business plan. For example, there's probably going to be a fee charged, non-refundable, $250, $500, whatever the state may say, this is the license fee. And once you get a license, Peter, you're going to have to renew it, usually on an annual basis. And that may be, somewhere between another $250 to $500 to $1,000. So,
and that's going to stack up if you're operating nationwide.
Well, that's right. Or if you just want to run one kiosk at a university, it makes it pretty hard to develop a successful business plan with that type of regulatory expense overhead. But Peter, I just want to run down a little bit more of some of the issues as to why this is something you should consider about operating your kiosk. Do you have to pay a fee just to apply? Applying doesn't mean you're going to get the license, but applying, annual fees. Are you going to have a minimum net worth for your business entity? Are you going to have to post some type of security? Are you going to have to present the state licensing group with information about your business, such as, have you ever been convicted of a crime? Tell me about your articles of incorporation, et cetera, et cetera. Do you have to have a minimum net worth? Do you have to, I think I mentioned post securities, and I've got my eyes closed, Peter, trying to think of some of the standard ones. But maybe, depending upon the type of the facts and circumstances of your operation, you may have to post some type of security bond with the state. And that can be, it's a large dollar bond in some instances, depending upon the facts and circumstances. But let's say that you needed to post a $250,000 a performance bond, if that's what the state calls it. That doesn't necessarily mean that you have to find $250,000 and turn it over, but you have to post a bond. You have to work with a bonding company to buy that, quote, insurance. But your point was the one I've been trying to make. These things can nickel or dime or dollar and $100 you, so to speak, into submission, depending upon the state where you want to operate. That's why we're increasingly seeing larger operations who can spread that overhead cost over a larger number of kiosks entering in the space, which, taking us back to one of the first points we discussed, kind of gets in the way with my libertarian sense that, the mom and pop kiosk may be more difficult to consider as a viable business model, given the regulatory costs associated with operating in the space.
I wasn't even thinking about it at a granular single unit level. I was actually kind of area I was going to go into was saying, does this need to be something that is federally regulated? Because if you are operating in, multiple states, do you really want to be applying for, 50 plus licenses? Would it make sense just to apply for one nationwide?
It would make sense. Is it possible that will happen in the future? I'm not sure that is possible. Now, please understand, I am not disagreeing with your point that it makes sense. And there are a number of states that are entering into what are called compacts, meaning that if you are a money transmitter license in one state, then our state will recognize that money transmitter license. So you don't have to go through the same process again. But our government is one of federal and state authority, and we have a terribly long history of state authority in the money transmitter space. Plus, we have a lot of bureaucrats in the 50 states that depend on the fact that they can run their own little fiefdom and generate their own fees, and they want to stay employed. So I think you'd have a lot of political pushback, despite the fact that in our space, the virtual currency space, does state money transmitter laws really make a lot of sense? I mean, that is a philosophical, that's a political discussion that we should have. But for the time being on this call, I'm kind of drawn back to the realities of the situation for us.
Wow. Okay. So how onerous is a money transmitter license? Is it more about some kind of background check, or are there requirements that you have during the length of the license? Let's say it's an annual license. Are there things that you're required to do during that year?
Okay. And the answer to that is honestly yes. Now, I hate to sound like a broken record, but it does depend upon the state. But of course. But that's right. Fair enough. But Peter, almost uniformly, if you're going to have to obtain a license from the state, an MTL, there will be the due diligence process of background checks. There will be ongoing compliance obligations regarding transactional volume, for example. Those types of burdens, administrative burdens, due diligence burdens, plus, and the financial burdens that you and I have, begun to talk about. Do you have to pay money to get your license renewed? Do you have to keep a bond in place? Do you have to maintain net worth? Do you have to have collateral? Or is it like Hawaii? And I'm not picking. I'm going to pick on Hawaii, but I think Hawaii law essentially requires like a reciprocal account funding demonstration that you have funds equal to the amount at which the transactions are occurring. And right now, I believe, and a Hawaiian regulator may step in and correct me any moment, that I believe it applies to a Bitcoin operator if you wanted to open your kiosk on the beach in Waikiki. However, it shouldn't, Peter. And this is my philosophical approach and not what the law is as I understand it. I mean, we have seen notable exchanges leave the state of Hawaii for the very reason they find compliance with this law burdensome. But the law shouldn't apply because, for instance, your ATM or your Bitcoin kiosk is a classic example of a counterbalancing transaction. You have put in U.S. currency in X dollars, and you have walked away with virtual currency in an exact X dollar. We're not holding custody of anything. We don't need to protect the consumer because the transaction was completed. It's over and done with. But for the time being, Hawaii is one of those difficult states from a state licensure piece. And that didn't answer your question, did it, about due diligence? And but yes, you will have to produce information. They're going to probably run a criminal background check on you if you're the owner of the operation that has applied for the state license. So make sure that your investors or anybody who's a member of your LLC, for example, if you are an LLC, is relatively clean from a criminal background check, etc.
Yeah. But I've got another question for you, because I guess one of the things that is in an advantage to an ATM operator, I would have said, would be if I was operating an ATM in Chicago, the person coming to use the machine is in Chicago, the machine is in Chicago, and the transaction happens in Chicago. So strictly speaking, they probably only need a MTL in Chicago. But then strictly speaking, the actual transaction itself happens, online. It happens via the internet, which means the actual transaction operates.
Correct.
You can't actually tell where it operates. Does it operate in multiple states? Because there's a distributed ledger, if the ledger appears on a node in every state of the country, where does it actually fit with the regulations? Do they keep it simple and just say, look, the ATM's in Chicago, you're in Chicago, so you only need a Chicago license? Or are there considerations for the fact that their transaction itself is happening across the internet?
The simple answer is they consider the money transmission event if Illinois is actually a fairly favorable state for virtual currency businesses. They saw it early. There are states worse than that. But let's go to state of your question, which wasn't specific about Chicago. At the state level, they will consider the money transmission event, that exchange that happened right at the corner of 3rd and Lake in Chicago, as the seminal event, despite the fact that the virtual currency, and there are so many other instrumentalities involved in this, they'll keep it simple and say, we don't care. Now, we mentioned Texas, for example, like if your kiosk was hooked up to an exchange, you're actually not loading coinage into the kiosk, but rather you're essentially buying it on the spot market, to use a different phrase, off an exchange. There you do have those instrumentalities you're talking about, but most certainly you will need to get a state level money transmitter license, even though you are actually transmitting what currency or Bitcoin about 2 feet from the guy standing in front of your kiosk to the kiosk, or vice versa, depending on whether you buy and sell currency at your kiosks. So they do keep it simple in that analysis.
Right. Okay. Fair enough. Because for exchanges, they have kind of a bigger issue that they have to consider having an MTL for almost every state, but maybe some block out New York because of the bit license. Okay, so we have to register with FinCEN. We have to have an MTL in each state that we operate in potentially.
Yep.
Are there any other regulations that an operator has to follow?
Well, Peter, I'm going to say do you have to have a local license to operate? Just kind of the nuts and bolts of actually turning on the lights at the location and turning them off at night, so to speak. But essentially, if you, as an operator, comply with the Federal Bank Secrecy Act's requirements for money services businesses, and then if you comply with the state level licensure requirements as needed in the states of operation, then you've pretty much solved all those issues that you need, unless by chance you are working with an exchange. And I will tell you that a lot of our operators will tell you that it's become increasingly hard and difficult to be an operator and working with an exchange. But the answer to your question is no. You've got 95% of what you need done. Other than the local licensure, or maybe you need to have a state license to run a business. Just you have to pay taxes. As a corporation, stay registered in your state, and all states do require businesses operating in their state to register, usually with the Secretary of State's office. But that happens 1,000 times a day, whether you're a tire store or a Bitcoin operator. That kind of stuff is very doable and clearly manageable.
It sounds like a lot of bureaucracy. It sounds like it could be quite tricky. There could be some missteps along the way. I guess you can't really do this without some kind of legal support, which is probably why Frost Brown Todd has moved into this area, right?
Well, yes. Now, I'm not trying. Yes, you're
allowed to sell Frost Brown Todd right now.
Yeah, I know. Now, I will tell you that in our space, we're beginning to see independent compliance shops that are working with you in that space. For instance, when we get involved in money transmitter licensure, we can lay out the framework. We've got to touch base A, B, and C, and this is how we've got to comply with this. And we work with the business. But sometimes it makes sense if you have to walk through the halls of the state capitol in Iowa to have a money transmitter license consultant assist you in that. So yes, you should not enter into this space without having a clear picture, generally gained through a lawyer, about what laws and regulations you have to comply with. But how you go about complying with those laws and regulations, that's where, for instance, in our business, we have an outside consulting firm that we negotiate rates with who know the folks at the state who issue these licenses, can go up and shake hands and have lunch with them if the state laws permit, so to speak. But, know how to get around the hallways and can help at a lower price point than a lawyer could getting that done. But, right. And Peter, I do appreciate the offer of pitching Frost Brown Todd, because I think we have a lot of very smart guys working on our blockchain team. We really do. There are places where a lawyer can add real value, and there are places where, as an operator, you can go out and do a lot of work on your own, or maybe you can find a consultant to help on some pieces of administrative level work that might be more economical for you.
Well, listen, any guest who comes on the show, gives up some of their time, deserves the opportunity to at least mention their company. So that's not a problem at all. Every previous guest has that opportunity. Okay, can I tell you the one thing that surprised me about the ATM industry?
Please.
So I was surprised that you could buy or sell up to $3,000 a day.
Okay.
I was just very surprised about that, and I don't know why. It just seemed like a very high amount, and I thought that's kind of impressive, really.
Well, technically, I believe you could buy or sell $1 million a day. Okay, you wouldn't want to.
Yeah.
And your customer wouldn't want to pay the commission or the brokerage, whatever you want to call it, the interchange fee that you would assess from your ATM, and you'd probably blow up the ATM itself. But when you get above 3,000, you have certain reports to file. When you get above $10,000 in a single transaction or a series of structured transactions, you have certain reports. The $10,000 threshold is the currency transaction report threshold, which itself is now under discussion. But most of the operators that we work with have a tiered system, and that most of those tiers cut off the transactions that can be conducted at a single sitting, so to speak, or over a course of a certain period of time at different levels. And many choose the less than $3,000 level because they don't want to get involved in the paperwork of filing the necessary reports.
Right. I see. I understand. Okay. Wow. Okay. So is there anything specific that manufacturers of ATMs have to think about?
Well, I will tell you that we serve as legal counsel for one of the world's largest manufacturers. And I do believe that they need to think about this. The kiosks themselves, the hardware inside them has to allow for the inputting of data that is necessary to comply with the federal laws. And generally, that means information. You need to have an interactive surface, of course, that allows your customer, the ATM's customer, to input data and receive data necessary for the transaction. Do you have a multi-factor system of identifying the user of your machine? Are you able to have the user of the machine, your customer, input data about him or herself where needed for your kiosk threshold? Does your machine, the kiosk, allow you to outflow the data to vendors that you may work with to do things such as to check the OFAC lists, to check lists against databases that you may want to run the customer through? Let's say he inputs his license as part of the kiosk. Well, what do you do with that data? Well, you're going to collect the data and you're going to hold on to it for 5 years because that's what the Bank Secrecy Act requires. But you may also need to verify or KYC, know your customer. And in that KYC term, that's essentially called the SIP protocol, customer identification protocol. So yes, the kiosks need to provide that type of functionality to the operator so that they can run a compliant business.
Right. Okay. Interesting. Okay. Is there any other areas of regulation that I've not asked you about that needs to be considered, or have we covered all bases?
I always hate to use the word all, Peter, because we're always surprised. However, in this instance, I will use the word all. I think we've touched upon only all those issues. We could probably spend a separate podcast on just the Bank Secrecy Act issue, or we could spend a podcast on California, New York, the various states' licensures issue. But we certainly have touched upon all the salient ones that I think we should cover this morning.
Great. Okay. Well, look, final couple of questions. Are there any new initiatives that are being worked on or that you're aware of that anyone working in the ATM industry should be aware of?
And the answer off the top of my head is no. At the state level, again, I do recommend at the federal level to get hold of the latest May 2019 guidance. Take a look at that. And depending upon the state level licensure question, to take a look at that, because there are laws that are coming on board, regulations that are being written and rewritten regularly. But no, nothing that comes to mind in that area.
All right. Well, before we finish off and say goodbye, the final thing you should do is you should use this time to tell people about Frost Brown Todd if they are interested in operating an ATM business, and how they can get in touch, how they can get hold of you, and why they should speak to you.
Well, Peter, thank you very much for that opportunity. I do appreciate it. Again, my name is Bill Repasky. I can be found at the Frost Brown Todd Law Firm's website, and you can see my handsome picture there and all my contact information. But my email is at brepasky@fbtlaw.com. I do recommend that anybody interested in the blockchain space and starting a business there, whether it's an ICO all the way down to a Bitcoin operator or all the way up to a Bitcoin operator, find counsel who is familiar with this space, people who have actually run people through the various aspects of what they want to do with their business operation, and get competent counsel early on so that you can see before you commit too much of your family or personal finances into the operation, what the entire picture is going to look like. At Frost Brown Todd, as I mentioned at the beginning, we have tried to assemble experts in various areas, and I guess as a lawyer, we're not allowed to say we have experts, but we have assembled lawyers who have experience in the various areas of the legal practice that are commonly and necessarily encountered by virtual currency business operations, from their formation all the way down to the actual operations of the businesses.
Fantastic. Well, Bill, look, I have to say, I appreciate your time. I know we had some fun and games trying to schedule this, but I do appreciate it. I know you're busy, and thank you so much for coming on the show.
Well, Peter, I've certainly enjoyed talking to you. Please let me know if there's ever anything we can ever drill down off the podcast into any issues. I am actually due out in about 15 minutes to start working on the newest craze in America, the hemp and the marijuana industry.
Yes, yeah, I covered that recently because they're obviously struggling for banking services.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I got to tell you, I think that is a real opportunity for a business person who can figure out how to do this. Whether it's, there is a new, there are many new initiatives. There's a couple that are just capturing the news because, sitting around with boxes of cash in your back room is not only healthy for you, but it's a genuine public safety concern. And because I do so much work with the regulators, just as a fun point, I was talking to a regulator who's responsible for banking in Colorado, Peter, who was called on the carpet some time ago for making a purchase of laundry machines. And why in the hell, to use the term, would a bank regulator need to have dryers and buy dryers? Well, the problem is, Peter, the U.S. dollar bill, $5, $20, $100 bills, reeked marijuana. And before they could put it in circulation, they had to try to fumigate it some way. And so here you have a banking regulator doing laundry or using a dryer.
Sounds like our next show, and I like to do them in person. So perhaps when I'm in, did you say Louisville, Kentucky?
In Louisville, but our Frost Brown Todd's offices are in many states, so we could get to wherever you are if it's more convenient. Yeah.
Well, I'm sure we'll find a way. Well, I wish you good luck with your business, though, and again, Bill, thanks for coming on.
Peter, I enjoyed it very much, and thank you very much for your patience this morning as we were getting hooked up. I do appreciate it.
Okay, so what did you make of that? Was that useful? Was that a beneficial addition to this ATM week? Did it answer any questions that you had? Did it raise any new questions? It's definitely helped with me. It definitely answered some questions that came out of my previous interviews covering operators and manufacturers. And the insight into the regulations that Bill gave me was really useful. And although this is specifically about ATMs, it does reflect the general landscape for the Bitcoin industry and explains a few things like questions I have from previous episodes, specifically around exchanges. One thing for sure is, though, I definitely don't envy the operators going through this regulatory process. Seems to be a lot of bureaucracy. I feel like there's a lot of oversight for things where, the system isn't abused that much. So, I don't know. Hopefully in the future, we'll see the regulatory lens kind of shrink a bit. I'm pretty sure it would make more sense to have one money transmitter license statewide, but I don't know what that actually means. I'll probably have a chat with Caitlin Long about that when I see her up in Wyoming. But yeah, a lot of hoops to jump through. And you know what? Some people are doing it, and I commend them, and that's great because it's really useful for the industry. But it does seem like it suits those who've got scale, those who can expand nationwide, rather than someone like me who might just want to put one in Bedford bus station. But yeah, it was really great to get Bill on, learned a lot more. It's been a great week actually learning about this side of the industry. It really does support the growth of Bitcoin. So the final episode for ATM Week will be out tomorrow. Make sure you check back in. And yeah, I've got a bad back, so I don't really feel like talking much more. If you do want to support the show, you can just head over to my website, it's whatbitcoindid.com. There's a page on there called Support. It explains everything you can do, whether it's a review on iTunes, whether you subscribe. Anything you can do helps the show. Anyway, I'm going to go and get my back fixed. Hope you're all having a great week, though. And if you do have any questions, you can reach out to me. It's hello@whatbitcoindid.com.